Good morning and welcome back. So Creative Brain Week on the first official day, looking at attention, starts with a relaxed session, and then we stay in a relaxed mode, really. But we bring to you some really extraordinary people. And so your host for this session, and really for the rest of the day, is Ian Robertson, Emeritus Professor of Psychology, founding director of the Global Brain Health Institute, and generally all-round good egg. Over to you.
Scrambled. Thank you. Okay, we're going to talk about attention, and I'd like to we had such a fantastic exercise earlier with the singing. Yeah, I'm going to keep you in that active mode. So I'm going to ask you to clap your hands every time I say a number. I'm going to say the number quite rhythmically, and but I don't want you to clap your hand to the number 5, okay? So clap your hand to every number. Let's just quickly do it. 1, 6, 9, 8, 4, 2, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 5, 6, 7, 5, 4, 5. Okay. That's the sustained attention to response task, which I developed 30 years ago in Cambridge. And it was the first test to really show the kind of problems with attention that people with traumatic brain injury have. Until then, there's a large group of people saying there was no attention problem in traumatic brain injury. It was just a problem of speed of processing, and that was wrong. But it was so difficult to show that, and that test showed it. But what that test does is to really set the stage for, we're going to hear Paul Dockree. I'll introduce him in a moment. But I want to give you a few other tests as well. So I just want to get you to, we did the lovely breathing exercise earlier on. I want you to breathe in for 4 and out for 6. Close your eyes and just breathe in for 4. And out for 6. Breathe in for 4. And out for 6. And I want you to keep doing that slowly and regularly until you're aware of your attention wandering from your breath. Try and focus on your breath and do that. And put up your hand when you notice your attention going. Yeah. So with a few mind wandering, I don't want to do this for too long. But both of these exercises test a type of attention called sustained attention. It's a very difficult challenge for the human brain to sustain its attention for a long period, for more than about 30 seconds on an unchanging stimulus. Now, I would like you to look down at the stage. In fact, you can look at me. Try and keep your eyes on me. My wife says I crave attention, so look at me. But without moving your eyes, I want you to become aware in this spotlight of attention. I want you to focus your attention on that door over there, okay? So look at me and focus your attention on the door and then Paul Dockree sitting beside the door, okay, without moving your eyes, okay? You're not moving your eyes, but your attention's on the door and Paul Dockree. Imagine I've kidnapped you all and you're looking for a way out, but you don't want to need to see where you're looking, okay? That's selective attention. That's the ability we have to select parts of the world, visual, auditory, body, selective attention. Now I want you to think, let's go into memory. I want you to remember a time you failed at something. It could be, remember a time you failed at something. It could be an exam, a test, a job interview, or a relationship. Something that felt like a failure. Just take 20 seconds to get yourself into remembering a failure experience. And now, I want you to remember an experience of success, of achieving something. Even if it's having that difficult conversation you didn't want to have, or passing that exam, or getting that job. Now think of a success experience. So that is attention in your memory system. What you remember depends on your attention as well. We can pay attention to vast swathes of information that we've stored in this incredible thing we call our brains. And I think the thing we most want to pay attention to, most want to pay attention to just now, is one particular memory, and that is of Chuck Feeney. We wouldn't be here today without Chuck Feeney. Our wonderful Global Brain Health Atlantic Fellows for Equity and Brain Health wouldn't be here, and our other Atlantic Fellows from our other programs around the world would not be here, and the amazing faculty and professors and associate professors we have here would not be here if it wasn't for Chuck Feeney, who was an Irish-American philanthropist who died recently, but who gave away $8 billion. He gave away everything and ended up living in a small apartment in San Francisco with his wife, Helga, with no car, just living, enjoying, and living off the delight and what he had spawned. And we would not be in this building without Chuck Feeney. He prompted the Irish government to finally invest in research and universities. We need another Chuck Feeney to come along because the investment is drying up. But he wouldn't have, the Institute of Neuroscience, this amazing building, Science Gallery, and the Nanoscience Institute, and many other throughout Ireland. So that's where my memory is, a memory of supreme selflessness and goodness, an amazing, amazing human being who decided one day, he was one of the richest men in the world at the time, to give away every penny. So all of these exercises, whether it's remembering Chuck Feeney or clapping your hands, that is attention, what we're going to be talking about today. And what and how we pay attention really defines who we are as human beings. What we pay attention to defines who we are. And optimists pay attention to good news, pessimists to bad news. Socially anxious people pay attention to the one frown in the room. Socially confident people pay attention to the one smile in the room. The powerful person pays attention to his next success. The powerless person pays attention to try and figure out what the powerful person is going to do next. And that saps their mental capacity. The creative person lets her attention play. The non-creative person relentlessly puts her attention to work or lets it be a slave to technology. So that's what we're talking about here. It's, along with connection and love, is the most important thing that defines us as human beings. It defines our collective capacity to survive, is what we pay attention to. So I have great pleasure to welcome two colleagues in the next 50 minutes, and then another colleague in the second hour. And I'll introduce them one by one. I'd like to introduce my dear colleague, Paul Dockree, who I've been working with for 24 years now, and he is a fantastic researcher, and he also makes his attention really sharp by shaving off all his hair and swimming in cold water most days. So he's a very attention-worthy, very brilliant scientist, associate professor in the School of Psychology at the Institute of Neuroscience. And Paul, I look forward very much to hearing your wisdom about attention.
Thank you. Good morning. I missed my morning swim this morning because there's waves and gales, so I didn't go in. But this will be enough to arouse my alertness levels for you. And on the subject of water, let's see if we can take this image up. So one of the most spectacular scenes in nature is watching dolphins swim. And when they travel over long distances, they alternate between diving into the water and breaking the surface of the water with impressive jumps. This is porpoising. And it's believed they do this to conserve energy over long distances because jumping through the air allows more freedom of movement. Now, the philosopher Thomas Metzinger has suggested that swimming dolphins serve as a useful metaphor for how our spontaneous thoughts emerge. So our conscious thoughts are like jumping dolphins. They're only in the focus of our awareness briefly before submerging into an underwater world of unconscious processing. So like a school of dolphins, there may be many thoughts popping up different times, competing for our attention. A thought might be half in and half out of the water, and we might learn to be partially aware of this before it jumps to the surface. So this metaphor, I suppose, serves to remind us that our conscious capacity is limited, that our thoughts generally are constantly in flux, and when we're not focused on a particular task, the default state of our mind is to wander. So paying attention is hard. Particularly when we're trying to pay attention to something which is inherently not particularly stimulating, like studying for exam or going to a boring 9 o'clock lecture. And we're all acutely aware that attention fluctuates, it waxes and wanes. Sometimes we'll be quite focused, and other times we'll, due to distraction or boredom or fatigue, our mind will start to wander. And this releases unconstrained, spontaneous thoughts, and sometimes, as the title of this painting suggests, we're not too impressed by the contents of our wandering mind. As Ian nicely illustrated earlier, sometimes this can happen. So, momentary lapses of attention, a little bit like cause problems. The silver lining of this, of course, is he's thrown away one of the most distracting items in the modern world, so there's some blessing in that sense. But there is a sort of darker side to excessive mind wandering, as we find that from clinical research, there are chronic sustained attention deficits in groups such as ADHD, in a variety of different brain injuries, and the reason why this is so critical is failure to focus is problematic because sustained attention is a gateway to our higher cognition, our memory, our learning, our reasoning, our social engagement, all affected by this key capacity. So it's a critical function that we all possess. How do we go about measuring the wandering mind just in typical individuals? Well, one approach we've taken is experience sampling. And if we think of a classic case where our mind will wander, we're reading a book, our eyes are tracking over the text, and suddenly we find that we're thinking about what's for lunch or an earlier conversation or a persistent worry, our mind has gone AWOL temporarily. So Jonathan Schooler from the University of California, Santa Barbara, devised a simple approach to track this. He got undergraduates to read Tolstoy's War and Peace for 45 minutes. It was not necessarily an easy read. And he asked them to just press a button when they noticed their mind had wandered. And on average, people did this over the 45-minute period 5.4 times. Now, some of you might be thinking there's a limitation to this approach, because when our mind wanders, often we're not aware of it. So to circumvent this, he used thought probes during this period and simply put these probes in and asked people where were their thoughts just at that moment. And he caught another 1.2 times on average when people's minds wandered. So this really indicates that we don't need to have a diagnosis of ADHD to suffer from relatively frequent lapses of attention, episodes of mind wandering. These occur to us at a fairly regular basis. So on the subject of the brain, let's talk a little bit about the mechanisms underlying mind wandering. Does the wandering mind oscillate? So as we transition from a focused and alert state to a kind of relaxed and disengaged state, we see a change in our neurophysiology recorded with EEG as illustrated here. So we see changes where we have high frequency beta activity, and this gives way to slower oscillations, which are these regular alpha oscillations, which you can see here. And in fact, if you bring people in the lab and you get them to engage in a simple attention task, like the one that Ian just described, in the short breaks between tasks, or even within a short 1 second period here, you see these alpha oscillations begin to emerge. But as soon as you're given a cue to do something, a warning cue followed by a word which you have to learn, you see a suppression of that alpha activity. And we've taken this idea a little bit further, where we've given participants a stream of these pattern stimuli, which are presented continuously, and they have to respond to one of these stimuli which remain on screen for a slightly longer duration. So there are no gaps where people can disengage from this task, so this is quite a nice measure of sustained attention. And what we see is two distinct trends. We see in this red line here indicates an increase within the alpha frequency up to the point where a person suffers a lapse of attention. And this can contrast to the blue line, where participants maintain or suppress the alpha levels and maintain it in a stable state prior to a correct detection. So this is consistent with what's called the alpha inhibition hypothesis. And this is the idea that we suppress the perceptual world around us as our mind starts to wander. It's often described as perceptual decoupling. So you can imagine decoupling from the perceptual world as we turn inward. And we've demonstrated, we were excited by this finding because it showed that we could predict when you were going to experience a lapse of attention up to 20 seconds before it occurred. And we've shown that if you give drugs like Ritalin, which increases dopamine and noradrenaline transmission, this can suppress the alpha rhythm and reduce its variability. So it's a useful marker for our attentional state. But alpha isn't the only story when it comes to lapses of attention. So my colleague, Thomas Andrelon, in the Paris Brain Institute, has looked at another marker, which is sleep-like slow waves, so in these low arousal states. So a little bit of background here. Traditionally, people have thought that what's occurring in the brain during sleep and waking are completely dissociable. So traditionally, we see when we're sleeping these large amplitude delta waves when we're fast asleep across the entire scalp from EEG. And this corresponds to synchrony as neurons activate and deactivate at the neuronal level. And if you contrast this to the waking state, we see that these EEG oscillations are more desynchronized, they're higher frequency, and at the underlying neuronal level, they correspond to more sustained neural firing. What Thomas discovered is actually we experience sleep intrusions while we're awake. So we see these isolated in time, little sleep-like slow waves occurring. They're also more isolated on the scalp than during sleep. And these local sleep phenomena seem to be associated with neuronal silencing, deactivation at the neural level. And so you can see here from Thomas's work, a sleep-like slow wave while awake and while sleeping, so you can see the similarity. These slow waves correlate with objective and subjective indices of sleepiness. So pupil diameter, when pupil diameter is small, it's an indicator of low arousal, and low vigilant ratings correlate with a greater spread or density of these slow waves on the scalp. And what's really intriguing is that our subjective states are different, qualitatively different, when underpinned by these different sleep-like slow waves. So, for example, if we are given a probe and we say we're mind-wandering, we see that these slow waves are distributed towards the front of the brain, over frontal regions, whereas if we describe our experience as mind-blanking, that is that we have zoned out completely, we don't have any content within our mind, these slow waves travel more extensively towards the back of the brain. So different qualitative states are characterized by the deactivation of different cortical networks in the brain based on these slow waves. In collaboration with Thomas, we looked at whether we could pharmacologically modulate or promote sleep intrusions in healthy individuals. And we found that the drug citalopram, which increases serotonin and induces or reduces arousal, we found that this increased the number of slow waves during a simple attention task compared to placebo. But interestingly, the presence of these slow waves, again, predicted different kind of behaviors depending on where they occurred in the brain. So if these slow waves occurred towards the back of the brain, this seemed to result in greater lapses of attention, more sluggish behavior. Whereas if these slow waves occurred at the front of the brain, this seemed to result in the opposite behavior, faster, more impulsive responding. So the interesting universal aspect of these slow waves is that depending on where they occur in the brain, which networks they temporarily knock out or neurally silence, they produce different kinds of behavioral errors. So it's a really interesting universal signal, and there'll be more work in this area to trying to understand how we can pharmacologically alter the arousal system to change the attention system. Now, so we talked a little bit about mechanisms of mind wandering, and it's clear that these intrusions in daily life are sometimes unwelcome. But are there any benefits to having a wandering mind? Of course, there might not be. We might have all evolved despite our mental inconsistencies, but it's at least plausible that there could be some reasons why the mind wanders. And I want to address three of those. So to enhance memory consolidation, to explore other rewarding possibilities, and the incubation of creative ideas. So during these dark winter's nights, fortunately they're almost behind us, but some of you may have been brave enough to watch a horror film. And one of my favorites is The Haunting of Hill House. So if you've seen that, you have my sympathy if you're climbing the stairs at bedtime and chilling images of the bent neck lady is in your wandering mind. And then when you go to bed and you turn the lights off, those images begin to penetrate your dreams. Well, as it turns out, there's an association here. The phenomenology of dreaming and mind wandering are surprisingly similar. So they both share waking anxieties, preoccupations, current concerns, imagined future scenarios. In dreaming, visual imagery is slightly more salient than in daily mind wandering, but social interaction and the involvement of others features in both these states. And of course, our memories feature in both daily mind wandering and nighttime dreaming. But these memories are kind of reconstructed with sketchy kind of narratives which are colored by fantasy in both states. So there's similar phenomenology. There's also similar neural substrate. So if we look at the brain areas that are active during mind wandering and during dreaming, they're similar. They involve the posterior parts of the default mode network, particularly the parahippocampus and hippocampus, are active when we're mind wandering, also during REM sleep, which is the signature state of dreaming. So this leads to the question, could both dreaming and mind wandering emerge, perhaps in part as a side effect of memory consolidation? So a common theory of dreaming is that when we go to sleep, we replay memories, usually over about a 48 to 72 hour window. And as we repeatedly replay these memories, they're consolidated in different parts of our brain. So a useful analogy here is sort of like backing up a computer. Your brain backs itself up overnight. And in the course of that backing up, various images flash into your consciousness, and you string them together with a kind of loose, semi-coherent narrative, which is your dreams. So the idea here is that your dreams are really the byproduct of another system, and that system is memory consolidation. So does similar things happen when we're awake, when we're allowed a period of rest and allow our mind to wander? Well, there's one study which speaks to this. So participants engaged in a simple story encoding period. They memorized a story. There was initial recall, and people were assigned either to 15 minutes rest, where they allowed their mind to wander, or a visual distractor task. And then they received a surprise delayed recall. And what they found was that mind wandering during rest enhanced the rapidity of delayed memory recall, which is interesting. And this memory benefit seemed to be associated with slow oscillatory EEG rhythms linked to memory structures within the brain. So there's some evidence, both in the context of dreaming and in memory, that there may be some benefits in terms of, and in the terms of mind wandering, that there may be benefits in terms of memory consolidation. Okay, let's move on to a different benefit. Imagine you're a bear in Yosemite National Park, and it's autumn time, you have to feast on berries. You're faced with two decisions, really. You can either eat the berries in the area you are, in front of you, or you can explore the broader area looking for where berries are perhaps more abundant and more ripe. So if you only eat berries in one place, in what's in front of your nose, you might miss the fact that you're in an area where berries are sparse and you run out of berries quickly. Alternatively, if you only wander around fussing where the best spot is to feast on your berries, you're taking time away from actually eating those berries. So I hope you would agree that the best strategy here is a balance between exploiting and exploring. Well, the same perhaps can be true for mind wandering and focus states. So the experience of mind wandering is exploratory. We explore remote or recent memories. We think about our plans, our desires, our wishes. The focused mind narrowly exploits what's under our nose, focused in a narrow sense on the task at hand. And we tend, like the foraging bear, we tend to alternate, of course, between these two forms of thinking. And we're somewhat predetermined to do this, because if we look in the brain, we see there are networks which are functionally and neuroanatomically opposed to each other. So the default mode network is active. It's actually more active when we're at rest and when we're mind wandering. But the frontal parietal network is active when we're narrowly focused on a particular goal. And we oscillate between these two networks. Can we provide some kind of behavioral or neural indicator of this temporal oscillation as we switch back and forth? The reading example I gave earlier is a nice subjective sense of what that's like. We're focused on the text, and then we drift away, and we bring our attention back. Well, a nice way to look at this is reaction time variability. So if we give someone a task like this, where they have to, this is Michael Esterman's work, you have to respond to city scenes and withhold your response to mountain scenes over time. And you build up a very clear reaction time distribution, or a reaction time variance time course. And you can see here these areas indicated in orange are periods when a person is out of the zone. And this high variability is associated with greater periods of mind wandering. In contrast to the blue trace, which is when people are focused and exploiting the goal at hand. And it seems that these networks I mentioned, the default mode and the frontal parietal network, are pivoting back and forth to support this temporal oscillation between these different states. But what's happening at cortex is not the full story. And to explain this attention variability further, we need to look deep within the brainstem to a structure called the locus coeruleus. And this is one of the brain's primary sources of noradrenaline, which keeps us alert and focused. And animal work has demonstrated that locus coeruleus, or noradrenaline activity, captures a full range of attentional states, from inattentive to focused to distractible when the activity in locus coeruleus is extensive. So we see this inverted U relationship. And Peter Murphy and your very own Ian Robertson actually showed one of the very first studies in humans to demonstrate this. Now, it's very difficult to measure the locus coeruleus in humans, but they used pupil diameter as a proxy for locus coeruleus activity, and they also demonstrated this same U-shaped relationship with attention performance. So there's a really exciting work in this area to understand how these neuromodulators in the brainstem orchestrate shifting and pivoting between different cortical networks. So there's going to be a lot of work in that area in time to come. Now, another potential benefit of the wandering mind was actually noted by Thomas Edison. This is a photograph that you perhaps won't see anymore. But he was a big advocate that the transition between waking states and the early stages of sleep was key to creativity. So he had a technique where he would sit in his chair, hold a heavy object in his hand, and as he dozed off, his muscles would relax, the object would drop, and he would wake up, and then he would jot down any ideas or creative thoughts he'd had during that period. So does this actually work, or is this just for the geniuses like Edison? Well, someone's done an experiment on this. So there's a task called the number reduction task. And I won't go into the details of this, but I can explain it to you if you have questions afterwards. But essentially, there are a series of rules within this number sequence. And if you follow those rules carefully, you end up with a solution at the end of the sequence. If you iteratively work through the sequence, the solution at the end is the number 4. Now, after a time of doing this logical number task, people have a moment of insight. And they realize that the solution at the end of the number sequence is always the same as the second number in the sequence. So 4 is here and it's here. And when you get that moment of insight, you're like, okay, well, this is easy now. So you can do the task rapidly. So what they did in this study is they got people to do this task as a baseline measure. Then they gave them 20 minutes of rest. And then they gave them a further opportunity to solve these problems. But what they did during the 20-minute rest period, was they used the Edison technique. They got people to lie in a room, to relax, to hold an object in their hand, and when they started to drift into early stages of sleep, they dropped the bottle and woke up. And they also monitored EEG activity during that time, and from the EEG activity, they were able to determine whether they stayed awake for the entire 20 minutes, whether they drifted into N1 sleep, which is the earliest stage of sleep, or whether they drifted into deeper sleep, N2 sleep. And here's the findings from the study. So they found that, remarkably, 83% of the people who drifted into N1 sleep and dropped the bottle showed creative insights in the period after their rest, compared to only 31% of people who stayed awake during that period. So that's almost a threefold increase in creativity. What's interesting as well is this benefit seems to disappear if you get into deeper levels of sleep. So only 14% of those people who drifted into deeper sleep, N2 sleep, showed an ability to solve the problem after the break. So this is interesting. It's a technique you could try at home. Don't try it with a hot cup of tea, just something. It means that when my undergraduates start to drift off in lectures, I don't feel so bad about it. I probably should throw a chalk duster at them just before they enter into deeper sleep if they want to gain the benefits. So just a summary of what I've discussed today. So we talked about some of the neural mechanisms, sleep-like slow waves, alpha activity, which predict lapses of attention. And let's return to our porpoising dolphins again, which were a metaphor for our thoughts appearing and disappearing from our conscious awareness. So why do these thoughts emerge? Well, perhaps because of memory consolidation processes, perhaps because of our exploratory mind wanting to look for other rewarding possibilities beyond our narrow goal-directed focus, or perhaps because of moments of creative insight. So I don't want to pretend at the end here that an excessive wandering mind isn't problematic. It certainly is. But adopting a rigid goal-directed focus is not the remedy. So a wandering mind can be adaptive, it can be constructive, it can be creative. So maybe various points during today, take the opportunity to turn your phone off, cast away any guilty feelings, and allow your minds to wander. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Paul, my mind did not wander for a moment. You did not hear the clunk of my iPad falling. That was fantastic. I think if it's okay, we're going to go to the questions at the end of all three sessions. But thank you very much, Paul. Really. I wish I could come back and be an undergraduate in your class. By God, you improved on my lecturers. It's really a privilege to introduce our next speaker, Tanisha Hill Jarret, who I'm proud to say is a Atlantic Fellow for Equity and Brain Health from our partner institution, University of California, San Francisco, where she now is an assistant professor. And Tanisha is really interested in a really important phenomenon, which is the increased incidence of, or the high levels of Alzheimer's disease in certain groups, particularly in African Americans, but also in women compared to men, and particularly in African American women, which is a huge, under-researched and critically important area. So it's a great privilege to welcome Tanisha over to Dublin, and I look forward very much to your talk.
Hey. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction, and many thanks to Dominic and the people at Creative Brain Week for the invitation to speak. And so I'll actually be talking about a paper that I recently wrote that considers the cognitive neuroscience of the radical imagination, its intersections with Afrofuturism, and how this actually can be a liberatory praxis for Black and other marginalized communities, and a way for us to really promote an equitable future. And so I actually really love this quote by Octavia Butler, who's an Afrofuturist, and I think it really speaks to the spirit of imagination and Afrofuturism, and I like to use it to set the tone for this talk. I hope it leaves you feeling inspired, and inspired to really move beyond what you know to be true, what you see, and also what you believe. And so with that being said, here's a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. Paul did a great job giving an overview of the cognitive neuroscience of attention, but I'll talk briefly about it, particularly visual spatial attention, actually, which is a topic I focused on in graduate school, visual spatial attention changes following traumatic brain injury. So it's kind of nice to have this full circle moment. And then I'll also be talking about time inequity and time poverty, and how it's a thing that actually impacts our imagination and minimizes our ability to think about the future. I'll pose kind of two questions. What happens when we direct our attention inward and focus on mind wandering, which we've already talked about, and how that's linked to creativity and imagination? And then also, what does it mean for us to direct our attention towards the future and to build new worlds? And lastly, I'll kind of conclude with some community engagement work that I'm doing that actually is what I would think of as the radical imagination in action. And it's work that I've been doing with Black women in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And so we all know that attention is a core cognitive function that's often been thought of as a filter. It allows us to select behaviorally relevant information in the environment. This is particularly important because otherwise we would be overwhelmed by the different stimuli, by the thoughts that we have, all the things that are happening in the environment. And so these two images illustrate the differences and two aspects of visual spatial attention. So in the left image, imagine searching for a friend in like a crowded street or a walkway. And basically you have a specific objective in mind, right? So you're looking for this person, you know what they look like, you have an idea in mind what you're searching for. You're using some sort of guided search strategy. And then in the second example, you have a ball that rolls out into the street while you're driving your car and you have to stop or drive around it to avoid it, but the ball rolls out and grabs your attention. And so this is actually really important because that illustrates the two different neural networks that underlie the different visual spatial attention. One of those being the dorsal attention network, so represented by the images in blue, and then the second one being the ventral attention network, represented by the brain regions in orange. And with the dorsal attention network being more top-down, it's more intentional focus, what we choose to pay attention to. And then the second one, the ventral attention network, being more driven by stimulus salience. So something that actually in the environment grabs your attention. And it's really interesting because they actually have functionally distinct networks, brain regions, and that they're connected by one white matter pathway, the superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is shown here in this image. And it actually can be parcellated in really nicely actually, using white matter tractography into 3 different regions, with the first region of the superior longitudinal fasciculus connecting the dorsal attention network, the middle actually connecting the 2 networks to one another, and then the bottom part of it connecting the ventral attention network. And so that allows you to see how these 2 networks actually can work in coordination with one another. So sometimes they're synchronized, sometimes one is inhibiting the other, and vice versa. And so we know that there's multiple demands of our attention. I know for me, I'm always going down the rabbit hole of looking at social media. I have emails, work, family demands, trying to sustain friendships, going to the gym, etc. So I want everyone in the audience to raise your hand if you feel like you just don't have enough time. How many people feel like, me too, right? And this constant pull of our attention in different ways leads to what people have referred to as this grind set. So it's really this belief that we have to do it all and to do it all perfectly. This sort of I'll sleep when I die mentality, which we know ultimately leads to burnout and can impact both our mental and physical health. And oftentimes the people that adopt this grind set mentality actually think that we have the same 24 hours in a day. And what I hope to show you is that this is actually a myth. And what I hope to show you is that time inequity is a thing that disproportionately impacts certain communities. And so I'll talk through a little bit of the logic related to that. And so what we see, particularly for Black Americans, which is my lived experience as well as the community that I work with, so I'll be speaking primarily from that perspective, there's really a pronounced relationship between labor and time. And a lot of this, like a lot of really, really great work around time inequity and time poverty has been done by Rashida Phillips. She's an Atlantic Fellow for Race Equity. And what we see is largely this relationship between clock time and labor is pronounced because Black bodies have been commodified via the transatlantic slave trade. And this relationship between time and labor shows up as inequities because of differential power relationships, right? And these differences in power relationships result in unequal distribution and access to services, goods, knowledge, et cetera. And one thing that I hope will kind of be gleaned from this is that time has been monopolized and manipulated in ways that actually impact Black Americans' access to time via the past, present, and future. And this time inequity actually impacts our ability to be well physically, but also our ability to dream and imagine. And so I'll walk you through a little bit of that, that logic. And so here's just a definition. I kind of already described it, but a definition of what time inequity is. And so when we think about the transatlantic slave trade, we know that Black Americans were intentionally disconnected from our African origins and roots. And so it makes it difficult for us to trace back our history and our past. And so in some ways, we've been actually disconnected from our past. When we think about present day, we see differences in income, and particularly across race. And so this is data from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and from 2018, and it shows the median household income between Black households and white households for people that have three family members, basically. And so we see that there's a pretty large difference, which means that people have to work more, therefore impacting their access to time, leisure, rest, et cetera. And so having to work almost twice as hard to make up for that difference. And then when we look at differences in wage across both race and gender, we see persisting trends in inequity. And actually what we see, the trend kind of persists over time, but when we're looking particularly more recently at 2022, reflected by the pink bars, what we see is that Latino women make the least, followed by Black women, then white and Asian women. And if white men make the most, and for every dollar, essentially a Latino woman makes 65 cents for every dollar that a white man makes. And we see that for Black women, for every $1 a white man makes, they make 70 cents. Again, this contributes to time inequity via the need to do more labor and less rest. And so we'll transition a little bit to thinking about the future. And so what we see in terms of future is health inequities. And so that's an area of focus of mine. I focus on inequities, particularly in cognitive aging. And what we see actually is abbreviated lifespans of Black Americans and also brown communities. And so there's a literal reduction in time that Black people get to experience, particularly on this earth. And so as a neuropsychologist, I focus on Alzheimer's disease and related dementia and how racism and sexism gets under the skin to influence Black women's brain health. And what we see is actually that Black women are about 7.5 years older biologically compared to white women who are matched on chronological age. And so there's been a hypothesis called the weathering hypothesis that was developed by Arlene Geronimus at the University of Michigan that basically proposes that it's due to social disadvantage. So it's not just biological, but the social and structural environment influences the biology to accelerate aging and to contribute to health decline over time. In terms of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, we know that Black Americans are about 2 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease compared to non-Hispanic white adults. And again, this goes back to social and structural determinants of health. So again, thinking about how this abbreviates lifespan and impacts access to the future. We also see disconnection from the future via murders by the police, with Black Americans who are about 2.5 times more likely in America to be killed by the police. And these data come from the Mapping Police Violence and Open Access database. And basically this shows the proportion of Black Americans in each state in the United States relative to the proportion of police-related murders of Black Americans. And so what you see is all across the United States, there's a disproportionate number of Black Americans that are being limited in their access or cut from their access to the future, with a disproportionately higher number of this happening in the Northeast as well as the South regions of the United States. And so literally for Black people, asserting oneself in the future is really a necessary and a revolutionary act. It's one that defies time inequities. And so I really like this artwork. So it was actually a billboard that was up in my home city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I really think that it speaks to the spirit of Afrofuturism. Okay, so now that we understand the relationship between attention and time, what happens when we try to eliminate all this chaos that's happening in the external world and direct our attention inward? So a lot of this actually Paul's already talked about, so I won't take too much time on it. But there's been this big explosion of interest in what directing your attention inward to think creatively looks like. We know already, thanks to Paul, about mind wandering. And it's also a combination of this mind wandering with deliberate planning or idea generation that leads to this. And there was a lot of interest in whether or not this required more or less cognitive control, more like top-down influence to create these novel ideas and to contribute to divergent thinking. And what we see is that it's not one or the other. It's kind of, as he shared, an oscillation between the two. And there's actually a coupling of the executive control brain network and the default mode network. And so the default mode network is what becomes active when our mind is wandering. The executive control network is what's more of the top down. And so up here is looking at the temporal connectivity of the 2 different networks. And you see over time the connectivity. So this is time on the one axis. And this is the prefrontal cortex, and this is one of the regions in the default mode network. over time, the connectivity to the other regions kinds of spreads. So it's really a coupling of the two. Okay, so now I want to turn our attention to thinking about the future and what it means to direct our attention towards the future. We know that future-oriented thinking actually is associated with the default mode network activity. And what does it mean to literally, like quite literally, think about directing our attention towards the future? When we think about any sort of freedom struggle, what we see is that there's an attempt to control and minimize our imagination. And what we know is that in times of precarity, imagination's always really been the answer, the thing that we come back to. It's been the source to creating new ways to liberation, to creating new ways of existing and being. And within the US context, I think of Harriet Tubman and her use of the North Star as a guide through the Underground Railroad. I think of Black women using cornrows as maps, so braiding their hair and using that as a form of communication to one another to escape slavery. I'm thinking also of the fact that they put rice in their hair, in their cornrows, and then use that to grow food after they literally escaped to freedom. And so again, these are ways of applying the imagination to create new worlds outside of that which people already existed in. And so really, it's the collective radical imagination that's the impetus behind many social justice movements. And in my paper, I talk about 3 different components. So we've already talked about what it means to imagine alternative futures, but radical hope and collective courage are also components of it. Radical hope being really the fuel that keeps the imagination alive. It's something that's really instrumental to Black culture. And I think that's something that we always come back to through religion, spirituality, and other cultural practices. And then collective courage is really, that comes from the community. Oftentimes when you think about social justice movement or freedom struggles, there's oftentimes a figurehead, but there's also the community members that keep that kind of spark alive and take oftentimes courageous and necessary acts to get to liberation or move society closer to liberation. And so why radical imagination? I think oftentimes radical has this sort of negative connotation that is associated with extremism. But really, when you look at the origins of it, it's actually Latin radix, which means root. And I really love this quote by Angela Davis, which essentially says radical just means getting to the root of the problem, grasping things at the root. And so when you think about what it means to address root causes, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the tree analogy. Here I think about it in relation to health, because I'm always thinking about health and brain health. But you see we go from underlying systems of dominant culture and narrative, which is reflected through the soil, all the way to your actual health outcomes, which are reflected by the leaves. But then you have all of these other sort of intermediate factors as well. And what the previous quote was referencing is getting to the root cause, which the root cause of health is these things listed here. So a lot of the isms or phobias, so racism, classism, et cetera. And so really to get to the root of the problem is to address these factors in society, which ultimately have consequences for health and health outcomes. Okay, and so now I want to transition a little bit to think about Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism intersects with the imagination to impact Black futures. And so what is Afrofuturism? I feel like I always try to figure out the best way to describe this because I get that question a lot. And I think people most often think about it in terms of it being an artistic genre, but it's really more than that. It's an epistemology or a way of knowing. It's a way of being, a way of relating to other people that shares the Black cultural experience using science, technology, and mysticism. And really it's important because it places Black people as the central storytellers of the future. They're the ones that get to decide what the future looks like. They also determine present and past. And through this, we can really start to challenge our ideas around who makes it to the future and who has a say-so in designing the future. And so there's really quite a rich history of Afrofuturism in the arts, wish I had more time to talk about it. Here we have Sun Ra. He's a jazz composer who literally created an entire different universe through his music as well as his acting. And he said that he belonged to this alternative universe to highlight the parallels of Black Americans almost feeling like alien in their own home. And so in order to escape that feeling, he created this alternative world through music and through acting. We also see Afrofuturism in the writings of Octavia Butler, and some of her books made predictions about the future that were eerily similar to like what's happening in society today. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the movie, the Marvel movie Black Panther, with the world of Wakanda, which is a Black utopia. Okay, and so we've talked about some of this already, right? So why is Afrofuturism important in relation to accessing the future and really moving people who are marginalized in society and their needs to the center? I think about it in terms of some of the clinical and research work that I do, because there's a lack of Black Americans in research studies as well as having access to clinical settings. And this really requires careful consideration of ways that we build trust with the African American community so that they are comfortable with coming into medical settings. There's a long history of abuse of African Americans in the medical setting and medical racism, essentially. And so I think Afrofuturism offers kind of like a culturally relevant way of communicating, of sharing information, sharing ideas. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I've applied it in some of my work. But here are the core tenets of Afrofuturism. One big piece of it is agency over who's seen and how they're seen, right? And so as Black people are at the center, then they get to decide how they're viewed and kind of dispel some of the myths or the stereotypes of Black people in society. There's non-linearity of time, and so we've already talked about the importance of time. And so time does not happen in a sequential order in Afrofuturism. And a lot of times when you look at sci-fi, they kind of play with that concept as well. As reclamation of image, reclamation of past histories that have been lost is an important piece, and reimagining the future so that ultimately we can achieve Black empowerment and Black liberation. And so I also like to think about Afrofuturism as a potential tool for brain health, one that potentially can promote neuroplasticity, which basically is the ability for the brain to reorganize its structure, its function, its connections, based both on intrinsic but as well as external stimuli, with external factors that promote neuroplasticity being the novelty, the complexity, as well as how enriching an environment is. And I think that this is particularly important when we think about neurodegenerative disease, because over time, people are losing neural connections, right? And so if we're able to design interventions and ways of engaging with people that kind of buffer against that, I think that's really, really critical. And so how does the imagination potentially relate to that? Well, we know that even just thinking about doing an activity activates specific regions of the brain that are similar as if you were engaging in that activity. And so here on the right, it shows the motor homunculus. So how each body region is somatotopically organized to distinct locations of the brain. So it's kind of like an anatomical map of the body on the brain. And so this map exists for motor functions as well as your sensory functions. And so, for instance, there's evidence that just imagining me moving my hand activates those same regions that would happen if I actually moved my hand. Imagining listening to music activates the auditory cortex in the same way as if I were to be listening to music. And so what I'm really thinking about is, what does it mean for us to imagine ourselves in new ways, in new states of being, and how can we really leverage this power of the imagination to create new mental environments, essentially, particularly for populations that have higher risk of cognitive impairment. Okay, and so ultimately the goal is to achieve healing justice. And really, so what is healing justice? It's identifying ways that we can holistically respond to the environment, or respond to and intervene, actually, on the impact of trauma on the body, on oppression on the body, the heart, and the mind. A lot of this work around healing justice is being done by Kara Page and her collective, as well as Prentice Hemphill, who I was listening to a podcast actually of Prentice was on the podcast, and they described oppression essentially as society collectively concentrating trauma to a group of people, right? And so what does that impact of trauma have on the body? And so I think about this particularly in some of the research that I'm doing at UCSF in relation to racism, how it gets under the skin, how it influences the body, how it potentially could accelerate aging. And in thinking about how healing justice may relate to the radical imagination, I think it's really important for us to think about ways that Black people can have access to the future, but also in ways of designing new ways of being in relation to their body to facilitate health and healing. Okay. And so what does the radical imagination look like in action? So I was really fortunate to receive a grant that had the opportunity to put these ideas in motion. So I received a grant from the American Psychological Association, as well as support from Creative Minds, which Luis will be talking about later in the week. So we're a collective at UCSF of artists, neuroscientists, where we use arts for brain health, essentially, in the communities in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so what we did was I partnered with the community outreach team with the Dr. Davis Center. And so that's an older adult center. Some of them come there just for activities, but some of them actually live in the center, in the residential part of it. And it's in a historically Black neighborhood in San Francisco, so a huge proportion of them are African Americans. But I designed essentially a 10-week workshop series focused on the radical imagination and Afrofuturism, and very interested in utilizing that as a tool for brain health and healing. And so here are some of the pictures of the women and the activities that we did. So each kind of session had its own theme, but basically part of it was psychoeducation about the importance of brain health and things that we can do to maintain brain health. There was also information about Afrofuturism and how it's relevant to aging Black women. And then we also did an art-based activity. And so that's some of the art that was created by the women. Importantly, not only were they creators of art, but they were also consumers of art. And so here is a visit that we took to the Institute of Contemporary Art, and they saw an exhibit called Rest Our Eyes, which really focused on the importance of rest as a form of reparations for Black women. And I don't know if you're familiar with Tricia Hersey, but she has the NAP Ministry, which actually really goes into detail of this. And I think that a lot of the art exhibited here was in the spirit of that. And so over the course of the 10 weeks, I really enjoyed it and had the opportunity to work with 44 Black women. And so part of that was creating a workbook that had the education about Afrofuturism, things that were relevant to Black women's wellness and brain health. So here in particular, it talks about the Strong Black Woman schema and what the embodiment of strength means for within a Black woman context, and how that can be related potentially to self-silencing, which actually has a negative impact on mood and mental health. And then on the right, for the reasons that we've kind of talked about, how daydreaming and mind wandering can lead to creativity, part of the workbook that I created has an exercise in daydreaming. And so this is just some of what we did. And then all of this over the 10 weeks, let's see if this works, culminated in a final photo shoot, in a final photo series called The Other Side of Time, which was an Afrofuturism themed shoot that was designed by me and photographed by Austin James. And so he's an artist in residence at UCSF who's working at the intersections of photography, film, and virtual reality. And you've seen a number of his photos shown throughout this presentation. And so really The Other Side of Time is a visual exploration of time inequities for the reasons that I've shared, but literally what it would mean for Black women to exist on the other side, where these inequities were no longer a thing. And so this photography and some of the artwork from the women were displayed at a community showcase at a local gallery that involved other artists who also worked with older adults in the San Francisco community. Okay. Okay, and then here are some of the photos also that were generated. So we worked for the photo shoot portion of it. We worked with 13 women. They ranged in age anywhere from 50, and the oldest woman was 93 years old. And so I think it was really fun to see them come out of their shells, to defy stigma associated with aging, as a, basically showing, hey, we can have fun. There can be pleasure and joy for older Black women. And so this also was turned into an interview series. Let's see if this works. Okay. Yeah. So I turned this into an interview series, and you can listen to the interviews on this website if you want to scan the QR code. But also we talked not only about how Black women experience time inequities, but how they can reclaim time, and what the future holds for Black women if racism, sexism, et cetera, was no longer a thing. You get ideas around what the future of education looks like. What does Black joy look like in the future? A number of things. So you can hear those interviews as well as see Austin's photography by looking there. Okay, so now I want to transition a little bit. It's your turn. Since we've talked about the importance of thinking about the future, I want to think about the future with all of you. And what I've done is pose some questions that I want you to think about in terms of creating an equitable future. Perhaps there's things that come to mind in relation to the work that you're doing, or even just like lingering questions that you might have. And so I'm going to have this up here, but there's a wall downstairs or outside. There's a wall that actually has these questions. And so feel free to brainstorm. There's sticky notes and you can stick it directly on the wall. You can also scan the QR code and answer the survey directly by just scanning that there too. So different modalities if you're interested in responding to that. And we'll actually be revisiting these responses throughout the week. So they'll be woven into some of the reflections, and then I'll kind of come back and summarize what I've learned from you all and your visions for the future. Oh yeah, sure. And that's all. So that's all I have. Oh, the questions, sure. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was such a remarkable and thought-provoking and important talk. Thank you very much. So next in attention is I'd love to introduce, I hope she can come up on screen soon, is Susan Magsamen, who is the founder and executive director of the International Arts and Mind Lab at the Center for Applied Neuroaesthetics of the Peterson Science Institute at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Susan's wrote a recent book, Your Brain on Art, How the Arts Transform Us, in conjunction with Ivy Ross, who's the vice president of design for hardware at Google. And this is Susan has a remarkable set of activities and experience and insights. I really recommend her book. And I'm really delighted for the opportunity in this session on attention to talk with you, Susan. So what I'm going to do is grab a microphone. I hope that's on. Is it? Yeah. And so I can look at you, Susan. Nice to see you again. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good.
And welcome to Dublin, to this session on attention. We've just heard two remarkably stimulating talks on attention. And I think you and I have talked a little bit about attention and the arts. But first of all, I'd just like you to maybe just tell us about your work and your book and your hopes and dreams for the future of the arts and neuroscience. It'd be lovely to hear from you.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. And I really enjoyed the last two talks. I had hoped to be there with you today in person, but was not able to come because, ironically, I was needed to pay loving attention to a family member who's not feeling well. So, but just hearing these last two talks really were so inspiring and made me think really deeply about this work that we're doing and why it's so important for so many different reasons. So, as you said, I am at Johns Hopkins and I work at the intersection of the arts and aesthetic experiences in an area that the science is called neuroaesthetics, and the field is called Neuro-Arts. And we're really interested in how the arts and aesthetic experiences measurably change the brain and body and behavior, and how that can be translated into practices for health, well-being, learning, community, for all of the things that I think we all really care about in service of humanity. And so we work at my lab in a lot of different ways. We certainly do research, primarily translational research. We also are very interested in leadership development, and I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of a global project I'm co-directing with the Aspen Institute called the Neuro-Arts Blueprint, and then also have been doing quite a bit of work in community development and outreach and education. So that's sort of the work that I do at the lab, and right now we are working on two very big projects. One is around creative youth mental health and looking very deeply at this idea around youth voice and why it's so important that youth are co-creating and really, in many ways, driving the solutions for how to really impact the global pandemic around youth mental health. And so we're doing that through as a collaborating center with the World Health Organization, and also with a funding partner called the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and are in the process of working in 5 communities in the U.S., but we'll be expanding that globally through a very immersive toolkit and learning community over the next year or so. And then the second thing that we've been spending quite a lot of time on is this idea around intentional spaces. We are in some space all the time, whether it's at home, in our heads, in the community, at work, at school, in healthcare. And we've been very interested in the dynamics of all of these sensorial systems coming together to really change our perceptions, create enriched environments, and create these spaces where we can heal and grow and flourish. So we had a conference last November where we began to bring all of the different stakeholders together and are now in the process of analyzing their voices and putting together a plan on how to really bring architects, interior designers, space planners, landscape developers, along with researchers and technologists, developers, and people with lived experience, most importantly, to really begin to start to think about how do we create these physical spaces, but also some of the insights around virtual spaces and immersive spaces that have the ability to really engage our senses in such sort of extraordinary ways. So that's some of the stuff I've been doing lately.
Yeah, Susan, it's where to begin. Could you tell us really what your estimate is of this, what feels like maybe a bit of a tipping point in a number of crises? I guess crisis is an overused word, but crises that have seemed to be coming to a head. I mean, you mentioned youth mental health. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has identified this devastating increase in all sorts of self-reported difficulties in adolescence that seems to really have taken off, particularly about 2012, in anxiety, depression, even suicide. And this is across the Western world, this is a global phenomenon. And he's identified two things, or a number of people have identified two things. One is that was when Facebook really took off in 2012. And the second thing is maybe a more distant one, but the lack of free play space, free play time that children have when they're growing up. And then there's a number of other real challenges facing the world just now. What's your perception of the role that your approach to the arts and neuroscience, that kind of combined effort, how can that help us address these?
So, I think the approach to the youth crisis is very dimensional, and certainly understanding neurobiology and child development across the lifespan is super important. But I also think it's very important to make sure that all of this work is highly interdisciplinary, so that we're bringing in historians and sociologists and anthropologists, public health, all of these disciplines coming together, I think, are really where the alchemy is to begin to help to create the container to really address some of these super intractable issues that, by the way, medical science has not really been able to address. I think there was this mythology that medicine was going to solve all of these physical and mental health issues. And I think what we're seeing is that what we've left out of this equation is our basic human evolutionary imperatives around the way we need to create and behold. The way, I was fortunate to talk with E.O. Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, before he passed several years ago. And what he shared was that the arts and aesthetic experiences are the absolute evolutionary requirement for how humanity has grown and how we've been able to bond to each other and make these connections and understand each other and communicate in ways that are beyond words. Our emotional range is so extraordinary, excuse me, and we have not really seen in the last, 25 to 50 years a focus on this ability. We don't value this focus on the intuitive, on the unconscious voice that comes forward in all of these different art forms, and the way that our bodies are telling us what we need and what we feel and what we know. And so, I think for all of the right reasons, we've made some really bad decisions about the way we think about traditional education. We ask children to sit in schools and to fill in bubbles. When they are not talented in making something, they're discouraged or shamed to be making something. And so they stop creating. And this ability to be able to find and share and ultimately celebrate voice wherever you are in the world, especially for young children, is essential. And you can see it in little children where before they've been sort of, I think, conditioned to know that there is a consequence to not creating, and they move away from that. They're intuitively, innately creators. In fact, NASA did this amazing study where they looked at, I think it was 3, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. And on a genius test, 95% of young children tested as genius. And genius is exactly what the last speaker was talking about, this ability to imagine something different, to have divergent thinking, to be able to think about the future. As they got older and up into third grade, those numbers dropped to below 10%. And so, in essence, we are literally training our children out of this imaginative, creative mind. And when you don't have that, they say that the opposite. Stuart Brown, who has studied play for now probably 50 years, says that the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. And I think that's really true. And I think that's what we're seeing. We have limited our children to performing and producing and pushing to the next level of some abstract model of success. And I think what we're now seeing is that there is a breaking point where when you can't feel your body, when you're not using your default mode network to daydream, to imagine, to mind wander, and to have that space between the notes. I think, the amount of sensory information that we're bringing in all the time is extraordinary. And, we're not able to process any near the amount of information that's coming in, but our brains do filter out the inputs that are irrelevant and allows us to focus our attention on what we think is important or pertinent or emotionally valuable. But you have to have that time to really be able to go inside and to have those conversations. I love that the default mode network is called the seat of self, because I think it's a really interesting idea that the saliency network excuse me, allows us to really think about who we are and what we believe. And so if youth don't have that, they're not able to integrate. And then in turn, the community that they're in can be so daunting and dangerous. And I think we're seeing all of that play out. And so, excuse me. If there is one antidote, I really think it is this idea around creative self-expression and the time to be able to find your voice and be able to share it in a safe space. And, safety and safe spaces are not just the absence of threat and potentially violence. Safe spaces are those places where you feel like you can share your voice. And another sort of, I think, contributing factor for youth is that even when they do share their voices, which is a brave and courageous thing to do, and a very hard thing to do, depending upon the age of the youth and where they are in their developmental growth, oftentimes the adults in the room don't listen and they don't take action. And so that's kind of a second injury to youth. So I think we have to be really careful in how we think about this as a way to help youth in honoring their voices and what they're saying, but also being part of co-creating the solutions and being able to work with youth workers and youth educators to be able to not just know what needs to happen, but how that needs to unpack. And I'll just say one more thing. There's a really fantastic leader in this space named Sandra Dumont, who is the head of the George Lucas Narrative Museum, who spent most of her career working in youth development and really spending a lot of time understanding sort of how youth want to be treated and what they want the adults to understand. And I think that's a really important place for us is to be better listeners and also respond to what we're hearing and not just sort of disregard it.
Thank you, Susan. In your book, you talk about the aesthetic mindset, which I think is a beautiful concept, and it's something I suspect that young children, before they go to school, have to a much greater degree because they think largely in images and not really in words. And it's when they go to school that capacity is actually extinguished because of inhibition across the two hemispheres of the brain. You get steady inhibition of this capacity for playful, purposeless, non-functional playing essentially with attention and with ideas. Susan, I believe you have a presentation, a brief presentation. If you have something, we would love to hear about the aesthetic mindset and the intentional spaces that you talk about in your book. We have about another 24 minutes before we go to questions, or 20 minutes. If you would like to make a formal presentation, otherwise we can continue this discussion, whichever you prefer.
Excuse me. I love talking to you. Let's just talk. Yeah. I think that's great.
Well, so there is I don't know if you're aware, there's a beautiful book about 40 years old now there was a young autistic child called Nadia, and who could do the most remarkable drawings and paintings and, just quite uncanny skill. And she was successfully brought into the education system quite late, maybe 7 or 8. She started to learn to read and write. And there was this very sad, complete abolition of her ability to represent the world in this extraordinary native capacity way. And it just strikes me that you were saying we've made some bad decisions in our education system, which actually last a lifetime, because people believe that they have to be doing things for a purpose. In the most materialist societies, the purpose is making money. In the least materialist societies, maybe they're a bit freed up from that ghastly monkey on the back, which is materialism, which is probably the greatest source of depression and bad health. So here's a challenge, because people then retire from this supposedly purposeful activity and they feel a void. And so many older people, particularly if they've had to experience the kind of time poverty that Tanisha was talking about, where they've been so preoccupied with just surviving, they've never had the luxury of envisaging playing with their time, regaining their hopes for the future and their fantasies of the future. So I do believe that, poor educationists and teachers, and I'm sure there are some listening here, are often burdened with society's problems and say, oh, you sort that. We need an education program on X. We need Y. But it strikes me that really we are at a point where we have to add some more R's to the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. There are some very important other core skills and orientations to the world that really apply to the whole world, particularly as AI is going to commodify many white-collar jobs, are going to go the way of many blue-collar jobs have gone, and people are going to be faced with this existential challenge and survival challenge, if you like, as their wages go down because their work is less valuable. So that's a long, complicated question, but the problem is, how do we... what is the possibilities of addressing this in some way to deal with these problems?
So, first of all, this is why I love talking to you, because you don't have easy questions. And I think that's really wonderful. So let me sort of step back a little bit to come at that, because I think, these kind of snarly questions that are complex really deserve kind of contextualization. And I think it's important because policymakers really need to have context and to make some different decisions to create the sustainability that we need for arts and aesthetic experiences. So if you buy into this idea that we are physiologically, neurobiologically wired to bring the world in through our senses, and that those senses are the kind of only way that we can do that. And we know that these arts and aesthetic experiences are sensorial, but they're also the most salient things that we do. And when I say salient, I don't necessarily mean most positive or always the most joyful, but they are the most cathartic. They have the ability to change us, to create these synaptic connections, to create the neural pathways that we need to connect different parts of the brain. We also know that these arts and aesthetic experiences activate neurological and also physiological systems like respiratory, muscular systems, heart systems, immune systems, endocrine systems, and they connect those systems simultaneously. So there are I can't even think of other modalities that neuromodulation that does that the way different arts or aesthetic experiences do. Yet we're leaving them on the sideline. So a lot of times when I talk about this, I think about the elephant in the room And, if you think about the arts and aesthetics as the elephant in the room, it's ancient, it's huge, it's been there forever, and it has tremendous power. At the same time, depending upon where you touch the elephant, so you're touching it for Parkinson's, you're going to get a different answer. You're going to get dance because we know that dance changes gait and sleep and mood. And it's very, very helpful. And the more we know now, the more people with Parkinson's dance, the better they feel and the longer they feel better. If you're looking at it for Alzheimer's, you may be looking at singing or activating autobiographical music. That was very important to someone in a younger life because we know about the way the brain can distribute different types of music and sound in different parts of the brain. So while the amygdala and the hippocampus may be deteriorating, there is still maintained structure in other parts of the brain. If you're thinking about child development, you know that you're looking at building these vast neural pathways. And so I think one of the things that and those neural pathways are super important when you are creating, building this capacity for lifelong learning for young children. And so, neuroplasticity, I think, is the sort of holy grail. We know that it is, you don't lose it as long as you're using it, regardless of the age. But for young children, it really is happening at such a rapid pace. We have a 9-month-old granddaughter, and we're literally watching her bring these neural pathways online. And it's trial and error, it's testing, it's really sort of serve and return. It's really extraordinary to be able to watch that. But I think if we begin to bring this knowledge forward, artists have always intuitively known that the arts change us in profound ways. And I think what the science married to art together is really helping us understand is how that happens and how we can expand our practices to do even more to enhance humanity and to be able to expand sort of our potential and amplify our potential. So when I think about music and playing music for young children, we know that myelination increases, so the sort of coating around the nerve fibers that are connecting different parts of the brain. Myelination is super important for a really active and fast-acting brain. We know that actual literal brain structure, the cerebral cortex actually gets larger. So, size in the brain changes when we're learning a musical instrument. And that work's been demonstrated many places, but Asal Hababi at University of Southern California has done some beautiful work there. We know that we're able to modulate between mastery and improvisation when we practice that. That's the work that Charles Lim has done at UCSF. We also know that for people with neurodiversity, and I think neurodiversity is actually a social justice issue. When we don't create spaces and places for people to engage in learning the way they need to learn, I think that's a deficit. And very much like thinking about other forms of intellectual disability or physical disability, it's really lack of access to these spaces through visual cues. We know, for example, with autism, that when you create opportunities for people who have some form of autism to be able to understand social cues in different ways, sometimes through cartooning or even sometimes through robotics, they're able to really expand their capacity and expand their potential. And so we know that learning happens through these highly sensorial arts and aesthetic experiences better than anything. We even know that doodling helps us retain and recall information better, yet we get our hands slapped with doodling. So beginning to change that mindset of when you change your lens, you can change your life. And I think that's a really important takeaway, is that when you shift what arts and aesthetic experiences are for us and how they can change these physical structures, but also psychological and behavioral outcomes, it makes a lot of sense to be able to start to move that into traditional education systems, not just after school programs, while that's important, but to be able to have that go from, community to clinic. And I think you can think about prevention and protection. You can also think about practice, just the daily practices, like we exercise, we eat well, we have sleep practices. Well, what about these artistic practices as daily practices to build the kind of reflections and aesthetic muscles that we really need to live a full life. And then also intervention. This work is so valuable in so many interventions, sometimes as a standalone, literally as a cure-all, and other times as a complementary or integrative approach to other kinds of physical or mental health or other kinds of issues.
Yeah.
So that's a long way.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you'd pause there.
No, I'm just saying that's a long way round the barn.
No. But look, it's that kind of conversation, Susan. But just to try and answer my own question, to follow up from what you were saying, what kind of, and I don't want to focus entirely on education at all because this is about all of life, but there is a kind of very well widely available globally type of education that seems to be closer to what you're talking about here, and that'd be Montessori education. There's a very interesting study that the brains of children who engage in a Montessori versus a more traditional education wire differently, and because Montessori doesn't ruthlessly focus on the verbal analytic systems that conventional education does. I wonder if because you're going to need something that's a movement almost. That carries people along, that people become enthusiasts for and advocates for. So that's my first thought. I just wonder if is that a possible route for us in trying to change to allow the kind of aesthetic mindset to develop. But just another example, Albert Einstein, he did very badly in school, well, not well in school. He disappointed his family very by his performance until in his final year of school, he went to a school, a Swiss school run by the Pestalozzi, who was an pedagogical theorist who believed that all thinking should be image based, and the whole education system was about fostering completely different kinds of approach to processing information in the world. And of course, his first experiments, now not the ones he got the Nobel Prize for, but his first experiments in the special theory of relativity were entirely image-based, of imagining a train going towards the speed of light. So, so that was a kind of Montessori-like education system. I'm just wondering, do you look around you across the water there and think, yeah, I can see traction here. I can see ways of achieving this at a policy level that's not just going to, influence a small number of people, but potentially could change the mindset, introduce the aesthetic mindset in a much larger number.
Yeah, the Reggio Emilio founder had a saying that was sort of built Reggio Emilio on, which was nothing without joy, which I think is also sort of an interesting kind of context. I started my career in arts and learning 40 years ago, and 40 years ago, I think everyone believed exactly what we believe now. We didn't have the science to really prove what we were saying, but we saw it. We saw it in the outcome measures of children that were engaged in the arts. We saw it through the relationships, through social emotional learning, through building executive function, through collaboration, building character. Educators could see this clearly, and I think that hasn't changed, right? That is really the case. I think in the 90s maybe, early 2000s, but for sure maybe the late 90s, there was a real push by the Department of Defense in the United States to look at arts and learning because they saw that people that were coming into the military were not prepared. Um, they couldn't they didn't have critical thinking skills. They weren't able to collaborate. Some had very limited reading skills, and this idea of the arts became more important, and certainly early childhood development and more early childhood learning became more important. And so we started to see that. But in the United States, I would say that arts and learning has actually been uh, much slower movement than I think it should have been or needs to be. I think it's beginning to start to ramp up again, and I think in large part it's because the research is irrefutable. And so I do think we are in a movement. I think this is not a 60-year movement where like when you think about women's health or even climate change. Climate change is probably a really good metaphor, is that we can't wait. We can't wait 60 years to make this happen. We really need to be, and I think it is accelerating this movement and making these policy changes now. And you're seeing, people opt out of the system, more homeschooling than ever in the United States, where there are these different kinds of techniques. You're also seeing an absolute flight from teachers who can't are so stressed in the environments of schools that they can't, as dedicated as they are, they're not able to continue with that work. I think that we're also seeing, so education is a very important sector. I'm also seeing this movement really happen in public health, and I'm sure some folks there will be talking about arts on prescription and the idea of how the arts are being used in community development in much more focused ways. In healthcare, we're seeing not only bedside medicine or but we're seeing obviously creative arts therapies, but we're seeing neurologists use and psychiatrists use arts integrated approaches. We're seeing medical schools use arts integrated approaches for teaching better observation skills. And so when I think about this whole field, I think of it more and more in sectors. In the business world, we're seeing, attrition and retention and recruitment to be huge issues, primarily around mental health, but also physical health. And so that whole sector is beginning to look more deeply at the role of arts and aesthetics that are more human resource focused around capacity building, not not a perk or not an enrichment, but because it's critical to creating this whole person and this whole sense of self. Alice Walton in Bentonville has actually been working in schools and doing some great work with arts integration. She's also built this amazing museum that's totally about the integration of Neuro-Arts, and now is building a medical school that's arts integrated, whole person oriented in a community that's really thinking about the role of culture, and many cultures to be able to learn from each other in diversity and build and weaving equity through all of that. I'm seeing it in all the performing arts centers all over the world. Kennedy Center is really doing some extraordinary work in looking at arts and learning and training educators all over the world around this idea around neuro arts and learning. And I think museums are also looking at their missions of not uh, not only having collections, which are incredibly valuable, but how do you create these immersive experiences where the museums serve as a way of bringing to life history and also thinking about the future and redefining and reframing what the past was. So, future is always, written by the leader, written by the person that has the money. And now they're going back in and looking at what is the history of this material, and how do we reframe that? And I think it's through often now an important lens of equity, and that's also really, really, really valuable. So I do see a movement. I see a lot of momentum, but there's a lot of work to do on all of these fronts. And that's where, again, I think this Neuro-Arts blueprint work and some other initiatives that are happening around the world are really important. We need to really coalesce all of these different fields. We need to break down these silos
Yeah.
between the fields, and we need to really build momentum.
And I think your focus on equity is critical here, and we heard that from Tanisha as well. The risk is for all of these new science-based developments is that the already privileged run with these, and that you get an expansion of the inequity as a result of that, with a kind of, for all the reasons we heard there, to time poverty and mental space to use these things. So that's why we have to be so careful to maintain that equity focus that you mentioned. But just a question about this aesthetic mindset and the overlap with, if you like, two different types of one type of motivation, which is basically doing things for its own sake, intrinsic motivation, versus extrinsic, or doing it for a purpose. And there was a very good paper recently in Psychological Science called The Dark Side of the American Dream, showing that actually people who hold materialist values, either for money, wealth, or fame, fame, or status, if these were your core, what drove you, what motivated you, you ended up with much lower well-being. It was a recipe for depression. And whereas if you had intrinsic values, which are essentially relationships, personal growth, and health, then you're much happier, even though you might have been significantly poorer as a result of that. So, and then in Ireland here, we have an amazing national institution called the GAA, which is an incredible sports organization for Gaelic football and hurling and camogie and other games. And it's the most amazing phenomenon of people working for no money. In fact, the players don't even get paid and they're international sports people of the highest level. And yet we have this incredible amount of well-being generated by this, because people are intrinsically motivated. They're doing it for each other. They're doing it for the organization. They're doing it for the love of the sport. And it can almost seem, if you're lucky enough to go inside it, you don't see it. But if you're outside, it can almost seem a little bit cult-like at times, but in a beautiful way. I had a year working with the Tipperary hurling team, senior hurling team, so I had a brief kind of period of where my envy could be sated. So my question is, and there was another, Daisy Fancourt is here, wonderful researcher, and she's telling us yesterday about a paper come out in Nature Medicine from her lab, showing that just having a hobby, this is across 95,000 people, you'll know this work, just having a hobby had incredible health and well-being benefits. And a hobby is the critical just example of doing something for its own sake, as opposed to for a functional purpose, for an extrinsic purpose. So I guess the risk is, if we call this thing the arts, it becomes another expensive thing that policymakers say we have to add in and cost money. And of course, the rich schools will get it and the poor schools won't. Whereas if we, that's what I love about your aesthetic mindset, is this, can we integrate these approaches to intrinsic motivation, the aesthetic mindset, to try and get something that's not an external add-on, but rather a fundamental change in the way in which we approach the civilization that we've developed, and maybe with an equity focus become less obsessed with trying to maintain power and increase wealth and increase status.
Yeah. So Daisy's work is really, I think, seminal. And the epidemiology work that she's done that shows, what really has happened when someone has a hobby or a leisure activity and how that extends their quality of life and also their lifespan. That work is really quite definitive, and I think it's really important work to share. It's so. I mean, I think what you're asking is super interesting. You know, um, this idea about ROI, right? Like return on investment is something that is always being measured in terms of money. And there's another way to measure through an economic model called true value. And I think that's what we're really looking for is what is a true value ROI? And when you start to look at that and you start to look at how um, having a living an aesthetic mindset life and the four principles around the aesthetic mindset are curiosity, and you think, oh, curiosity, but a lot of people have become very transactional. It doesn't seem to pay to be curious. Young children are asking fewer why questions because we're so engaged in these obligations and this striving to get ahead, to move ahead, to push forward. But this idea of curiosity is really important. And then the second is playful exploration. And it's exactly what you said. It's being able to do something and explore and discover without an intended end, without an object that you necessarily make, without some kind of defined conclusion. And so ambiguity, I think, is also part of curiosity, but being in these spaces where you don't know what's going to happen and you don't need to know what's going to happen really expands our capacity for wonder and awe in extraordinary ways. And then I think being more mindful of your sensory surroundings. And so that's number three is sensory awareness. Like what is the temperature in the room? How does my skin feel? What am I smelling? How does the sun feel on my face? I mean, just if you think about how our bodies bring the world in, it is magic. It is the closest thing to magic that I know. Each of your fingertips have 3,000 touch receptors. Your body has over 4 million touch receptors. We have the ability to process trillions of odors. Our bodies are these unbelievable mechanisms.
Susan, I'm going to break into you there. I'm so sorry. I've completely lost the run of myself. We're way over time, and we need to. We want we want to have questions. And we want to have Tanisha and Paul coming up to the platform. But I just want to say thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to Dominic now, who's going to take it. But it's been wonderful talking to you as ever. Thank you.
Stay with us.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Stay with us. So I love that we get to the point where we're talking about emergent potential, and we're talking about spaces in which we're not quite sure what's happening, but that's okay. It's a very good description of how Creative Brain Week opens up. I was going to say unravels, but really I mean expands. Susan, I thank you and Ian for the conversation over the last 40 minutes or so, because I'm very aware that when we planned this, we planned that you would be here in Dublin, and then, because circumstances work differently, it's now something like 4:30 in the morning. So I have a new aim in life, which is to be as eloquent as you are at 4:30 in the morning. If I can do that, then I think I've succeeded.
It's 7. The birds just started singing, so it's good.
Dawn chorus, we're fine from here. So we've invited back Tanisha and Paul. Ian is staying with us. Susan is online, and we'd like to open it up to the audience. What we want to do, though, is take 2 or 3 questions. I have somebody up there running around with mics. So if you have a question, there's one down in the front. I'll try and take 2 at a time, I think, if I can. So we have a hand in the front. Please come down. Thank you very much for... Just talk, it's fine. We'll pick you up.
Arts are completely integrated. into ways of living, into belief systems, into the way we celebrate, the way we grieve. And sometimes you come to these and they're so removed from these systems, and there's this impression that we're creating something new, whereas it's this materialistic system, colonialism, and the academic setup that has supported these separations, right? So how do we actually address that in a more equitable way, particularly in these spaces that are making it sound like we're doing something new? We're not. Thank you.
Susan, we might start with you, and then we might come back to people in the room. Is there another question? We'll take a second one, though. Yep, Susan, go. For you.
So I just want to make sure that I understand the question. Correct me if I'm wrong, that I think what I hear you asking is how do we make spaces more equitable, and that's really something that correct me if I'm wrong, but that it's an age-old question. And so how do we really think about doing that? Is that the question?
Partly, but I'll add on to it. Go. Yeah. Yeah, so I can... So the question is partly academic environments in a way separate things that are in other places and in other traditions already integrated. So it's the academic institution or the institutions that we work in quite often that have passed out different ways of working and being and knowledge making. All right? Yeah. And partly these conversations are about how do you put them back together, whereas in other parts of the planet maybe they're already connected. Susan, any thoughts?
Yeah, ivory tower, right? I mean, I absolutely think that academic institutions have really become quite separate in many places, and that they are disconnected. And I do think there's an effort, however, to begin to sort of break down those barriers. But I even see it in these sort of created spaces where the world within the academic environment sets an expectation for students that is also not achievable. So the students, the faculty, the staff are actually in these tensions of opposites where there isn't a sense of wholeness. So it isn't arts and sciences, it's sciences. And if you maybe have time for art, there's art. But the expectation of academic rigor in spaces like that are really also, I think, become quite damaging for students. And I think faculty are feeling that. But how you bring that outside and have that integrate, I think it's a porousness that we're looking for between the academic community and the world, and the academic community being able to learn from culture and community and people with lived experience, where academic is not the only thing, right? It's a thing and it's an important voice, but it's not the only important voice. And I think moderating that is something that is beginning to happen, but I think it's a very slow churn. Right now, I think academic institutions are under a lot of scrutiny because of the policies that have been historic. And I think we are seeing changes. We're certainly seeing changes in leadership. We're seeing it from the bottom up and top down and sides in. So I guess I just would say I agree with you that academic institutions have a lot to offer, but I think they've been historically positioned as the authority and not one of the people around the table, not one of the groups around the table.
Thank you. So I'm just going to see if there's more questions for the people in the room. We're going to need to wrap it up shortly, but there's one question over here that I can take. Oh, please, Tanisha. Yeah, Tanisha, you've got a comment.
Actually, I really appreciate that question, and I think it's something that I've struggled through and am struggling through being in academia and also trying to create radical imagination within the San Francisco community. And I think it largely highlights this Western way of knowing, way of being that's largely rooted in empiricism. And evidence-based, and that's kind of in contrast to these indigenous, intuitive ways of knowing and being. And yeah, it's something that I feel like in academia, it's about productivity, it's about creating new knowledge. And as you said, these forms of knowledge and these ways of being and thinking, and even thinking about the future, already exist. And I think it's really critical for us to, at least in the Western world, to step outside of our knowledge base and what we think we know, and collaborate. And so looking to other ways of knowing, looking to other ways of creating new knowledge, and that largely comes from reaching out, that largely comes from talking to other people. So let's talk. Let's talk after.
We have time for one more question, and then I need to wrap everything up, but please.
Thanks. My question is directed towards Professor Robertson there, please. Just in terms of youth mental health, you were saying that in 2012 you saw a rise in issues among adolescent mental health. I guess I'm surprised because I thought it would have been more a steep rise after COVID. Just looking at kind of youth that I work with, there seems to be a huge rise in mental health issues among adolescents post-COVID. And I'm wondering if it's related to, lack of access to the arts, but I'm just wondering if you could maybe expand on what happened in 2012, what happened in 2020, and how we can fix or do better. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I fear you've heard quite enough from me, but just to say that was Jonathan Haidt's work from 2012. COVID undoubtedly, particularly poorer communities, suffered a lot. The kids who were deprived of education in some areas of the world for 2 years, and it was just quite awful what happened to them, and the loss of mental capacity that caused was and the emotional problems. But the trend, the blip was far greater after 2012 than it was after COVID. Thank you.
Paul, any thoughts to add in?
I suppose one important thing to add is probably the role of social media in siloing or limiting our imagination in certain ways. And I think there's the sense of the echo chamber and suppressing the connections to others. It's a tool which initially was set out to connect us, but often it's the case that we're presented through AI with stuff we find familiar, stuff we enjoy. So we ultimately end up exploiting the same aspects of our attentional focus, our cultures, and so on. And I think that is a problem in terms of shared cultural experiences and attention to diversity. And I'm not sure what the solution to that is, but certainly we have industries using persuasive design to try and keep us engaged, keep our reward circuitry engaged in certain ways, which may be counterproductive to our imagination. So that's something worth considering.
And it's something that we'll go on to in day 2 when we talk about connection, when we talk about whether we're connected or just networked. But today's mainly focused on attention. I'd like to thank Susan Magsamen, Tanisha Hill Jarret, Paul Dockree, Ian Robertson for getting us off to a cracking great start. Thank you all.
Thank you.